Today I have the great pleasure of talking to someone who is just highly recommended by a couple of the people I know. His name is Wayne Peet. He is a jazz musician, but also a widely known recording engineer. A lot of people that I know have worked with him or worked in groups that were recorded by him. He's done a lot of work with Jeff Kaiser. Andrew Pask raves about him as being like his favorite engineer he's ever worked with. So that was more than enough recommendation for me. I'm really anxious to talk to Wayne, so let's kick right into it. Hey Wayne, how's it going?
Pretty good.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, my pleasure.
So let's start off by hearing a little bit about what you've got going on right now.
Well, as usual, I juggle a lot of things to make a living between playing keyboards and engineering. I have some regular church gigs that I do, as well as concerts with various people. In a week or so, I'm playing with Roberto Miranda's group, the bass player from L.A., who was also my first record credit. He invited me onto one of his records back in the late 70s. He's put together a group more recently, which we recorded at my studio, and I'm also in the process of now editing and mixing that session. So that's one thing that's going on there. I have a number of clients, from amateurs to professionals to real artists to wannabes, as anybody with a studio usually ends up with. So I've got a few of those things going on as well. And being freelance, when I look out 2 months, I usually have nothing in the calendar. But when I'm actually down to it, I'm working 16 hours a day for months, so can't complain.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, I do some writing for Recording Magazine, which is really oriented towards novice and upcoming recording engineers and stuff. And I think the perception of what of running a studio is like, and especially being an independent engineer is like, I think it's really different than what a lot of people assume. I think that they don't really kind of understand the terror of 2 weeks out always looking like, a cliff that you're going to jump off of.
Yeah. Well, and it's different now, too, with the demise of so many commercial studios, And I've been able to, since I have my studio's converted garage, like that's morphed into parts of my house and other buildings on the property here, I've been insulated a little bit from having to make a monthly nut on also a commercial space.
Commercial site, right.
So I just have to make the nut of my mortgage, which, because I've had the opportunity a couple of times where people wanted me to, and I would have kind of liked to have more space, but in the long run, just the economic security of not having to worry about that as much and dealing with the space issues and working at home in L.A. where you don't have to, drive, for 3 hours to get 20 miles is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I have to admit the one commonality of everyone I know from LA is that somehow traffic and driving gets wedged into conversation. It is it's like the bloodline of life there. Yeah, indeed.
And my commute is like down my stairs into my studio, so
yeah, it sounds pretty perfect, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I like doing in a podcast is I like to talk to people about their background and how they got into their gig. Now, I got an opportunity to read a little about you, particularly the write-up on you in Tape Op, and it was really fascinating to kind of hear about it. I'd like to hear maybe a little more depth of that, kind of how you got started in music, and then how that morphed into the recording world.
Yeah, it was kind of a morph because I didn't really intend to become an engineer. I did intend to become a musician. Having read your background blog, I grew up in a similar kind of circumstance in conservative Christian church environment. My dad was a minister in smaller towns. He moved periodically, so I had some larger towns, but high school was in Imperial Valley, which was a town, Imperial, in that place, which was 3,000 people, so pretty small town. I took piano lessons from when I was a kid, played in church, I also played trombone as well as piano up through college, and just was interested in music. In my senior year of high school, I just decided I wanted to pursue music, and not as a teacher,
Right.
but as a performer, because it seemed kind of, I mean, I really respect great music teachers, but I just wasn't feeling that. And there's also plenty of people that teaching is somehow a second choice, you know, because they couldn't make it.
Yeah. Teaching as plan B never really seems to be that great of
Yeah,
a
and
thing.
does no respect to great teachers, because I've had some really great teachers, and those are the people that should be teaching.
Right, right.
So anyway, I had a lot of support at home. My dad was a much more intellectual type of person than the usual conservative Christian people, especially that people expect nowadays.
Right, right.
Because it's kind of morphed into a hate group.
Yeah.
But not when I grew up. It was more like just kind of a more isolation, kind of doing their own thing type of vibe. Not as political as it is now. And there was plenty of stupid stuff to rebel against. But I never really pursued music in any kind of rebellious way. I was just curious about it, and my parents were respectful of that. And I used to try to, you know, share stuff with them, have them listen to the stuff I was listening to and whatnot.
Yeah.
And one of the big changes for me was in high school, like just having kind of a spiritual experience listening to some really loud rock music on my stereo that wasn't Christian. You know, it was like secular. And at that point I realized there was no sacred secular divide. It was just music.
Right.
You know, it was a big breakthrough for me. And then I went to college and majored in music at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, which was a Christian liberal arts college, but it was more academic than some of the other choices in religious schools where their music major would be like a church music major as opposed to just a music major. And at that was also a fairly small school, and one of the things that was great about that is I met a bunch of people that ended up becoming long-time colleagues, and there was a whole little movement of artists, poets, and musicians that kind of coalesced around this one art teacher there. We formed this group called the Frobisher Hall Art Ensemble because at that point some of us were really into the Art Ensemble of Chicago and some of that stuff. And it combined with people that were all also interested in more straight-ahead kind of jazz, and we kind of morphed that into this group that kind of encompassed everything from standards to free improvisation. That was kind of like the most important part of my college thing, more than the academics, because like the head of the music department would make some really stupid comments about jazz. And at one point I gave him a listening list to counter the listening list that he was giving me of classical music, just because he had really no idea about jazz.
Right.
Anyway, that was kind of, and so how I got into recording was during college I got a TAC 4-track 3340S just to record my own stuff, and started doing that. And as you probably know, that has simul-sync and you can do overdubs and stuff.
Yeah.
So it was a combination of recording live events with either 2 or 4 mics, and also doing, you know, starting to work with like overdub type of projects. So it started just myself. Then when I ended up moving to LA, like a year out of college, and I've been here ever since, I had a piano that I bought and put in my living room in the house I was sharing with my brother, and that became my first kind of studio. The big breakthrough for me was when DATs came out, because you could actually do completely professional record quality stuff.
Final product, yeah, right.
Yeah, I found out that I could do that and make money to buy more gear by hiring out. So that was the next step in kind of moving in. My advantage was a lot of jazz musicians would go to rock and roll studios that they could afford, and the engineer wouldn't have any idea how to deal with that music because they were used to doing rock and roll.
Right.
So, first clue is when you walk in with an upright bass and the guy calls it a cello, you're dead. But I knew the music, so since it was live to dat, you had to mix it on the fly. You had to know where the solos were coming,
Right.
When the head was going to come, that kind of stuff. And I was aware of that kind of stuff, so I had an advantage that way. So I could, when I did these first jazz, live mix stuff that I did to dat, they would turn out better than somebody that didn't understand the music trying to do it.
So was that because, were you reading charts with them, or was it just because you were kind of tuned into kind of body language these people were playing with?
I guess both, and just, when you just ask them too,
I see.
They're going to, if it's a typical jazz tune, it's going to have an in-head and an out-head and then solos in the middle.
Right.
So you'll ask them, what's the order of solos?
Got it, right.
Okay, it's trumpet, piano, bass, and then the out-head. So you're kind of waiting for, okay, next is the piano solo, so I'm going to turn up the piano slightly.
Yeah.
And then when the bass solo comes, you add a little reverb to the bass and turn it up, and then when the out-head is coming, you can kind of feel it coming. Even if you don't have the chart, you've heard the in-head, so you kind of know basically what's going to happen.
What's coming, right, yeah.
Yeah, so those kind of things kind of fed into me being an engineer.
Sure.
Even at that point, I used a pseudonym for my engineering because I didn't want it to cross-pollinate into my musician credits.
Right.
So some of those early records, it says Peet Edwards.
Oh, interesting.
Which is my middle name and my last name first. But after a while, I realized, who cares?
Right.
It's just me. I do all this stuff. And then you worry about, people think you're a jack of all trades, master of none, but I just try to be good at everything, and I don't care anymore what people think.
Well, it seems, though, too, your timing in terms of bringing your perspective to the music was probably pretty on the nose, even without knowing it, because it was a time where all the money was flowing through rock sessions into studios, so, that was kind of the format there. All classical music, which is a completely different style of recording technique and stuff, that was all happening in halls. There wasn't really a well understood recording environment for jazz music, and so.
Well, especially if it wasn't big budget,
Right.
labels or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And so by being a player and someone that would have interacted with a lot of local musicians, that probably put you in a pretty good place to say the guys at the rock studio aren't going to get it right. And when you hear what they try and do, it's just so tone deaf, it's really rough.
Yeah, well, and they're doing stuff like, using over compression and
Right.
Which sounds great on rock,
Yeah.
But if you're trying to move to a kind of faux natural thing with, both classical and jazz, and which doesn't mean that you don't do studio trickery. It just means that you don't want to hear it.
Right.
That's
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I had a good friend who had a jazz ensemble that had, they spent a pile of money to get a recording done, and he seemed to be pretty proud of it, and he came and had me listen to it, and it sounded like the whole band was being squeezed through a toothpaste tube. The compression was so heavy duty, and you know what? An upright bass does not sound good when it's heavily duty. It just doesn't.
Especially if you're trying for a naturalistic sound,
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure.
And the same with a jazz ride. The whole, it even seems like the timing changes because you don't have the
Yeah, 'cause
natural
the
decay.
whoosh becomes louder than the attack.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's really weird. So I can see where your sensitivity to what the music should sound like ended up being a really valuable thing for these players. Now, one of the things I notice when I look at the discography of what you've been involved in is it actually sort of matches this the band that you were involved with at Westmont, where it seems like it ranges kind of from standard jazz. I know it's like Kenny Burrell is like one of the people who recorded and stuff, and I think of him as kind of like one of the classic standards guys, right? But going
Sure.
all the way through people like Nels Cline, which is some of the stuff can be jazzy, but some of the stuff that you actually recorded was really on the almost aggressive avant-garde side, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the advantages of people my age, I think, is that there's less, who are associated with jazz anyway. There's less of the angry jazz guy of people that were a little older than us, who really hated rock because, in the 60s, some kid with a guitar could like learn guitar in a week and then do something in his garage and become famous, whereas these guys had worked their whole life to, become these virtuosos, and now they couldn't get any work.
Right.
So there was a lot of animosity about that.
Right.
But people my age like grew up listening to a lot of stuff, and we really weren't prejudiced against certain types of music, and just enjoyed rock and jazz. It's just like different kinds of good music.
Right.
So there's no big divide for me in that regard. So I mean, I've done everything, including in my playing, from just complete noise, free-for-all stuff to very conservative standard stuff or classical or whatever, to hip-hop, to just tons of different stuff, world music. And it's just, to me, it isn't a division there, But I did get kind of known as doing jazz, live music.
Got a reputation for that, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you find that you have to like tweak your techniques or your ear or anything in order to match the kind of music you work, or do you kind of assume that if people are coming to you, they understand what they're going to get, and they're looking for your ear as it is?
A little combination. I mean, of course, there's different kind of aesthetics that you don't want to bring a classical aesthetic to a hip hop thing necessarily.
Right.
It's kind of not that. It wouldn't work totally. There's certain kind of overarching principles that will help. Like, one of my pet peeves is just good mic placement, which doesn't mean that you spend a week getting a snare sound, but it's just I have to mix stuff that people bring to me, and it's appalling sometimes. Like, how people can't point a mic at something that they want to record, which to me doesn't seem that hard.
Right.
But I've had stuff from major studios like Capitol and Westlake and stuff that just sound like crap, and they've got really good gear. So it's
really good monitoring facilities. You'd think they'd be able to hear the problem.
It's just knowledge and listening.
Yeah.
I think, or caring, because the number one, requirement, I think, in engineering, whether it's for PA, live stuff or in the studios, to give a shit.
Right. Right.
And you got to really care about trying to make it good. Even if it's something you go like, not really into this, but your job is to try to make it as good as you can make it. And there's a surprising amount of people that don't care.
Right.
And are the job, they're just getting through the session. Oh, this is bullshit, and it shows up. And that kind of attitude never helps anybody, and it'll hurt the engineer worse than anybody else, I think. I've never understood that. It's like, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it, do it right, or do it as best you can.
Yeah, well, I don't understand how those people can, especially fulfill the role of recording engineer. I think if you're a producer, you could just say, well, I'm not any good at producing hip-hop, for example, so I'm not going to take those gigs. Where with being a recording engineer, it's more like you have to be able to sort of chameleon yourself to be supportive in whatever role the artist needs, but also to really focus on great sound. And I think if you can get to the point where you don't care if it sounds good or not, it seems like you either need to find another job or kick yourself upstairs to be a producer. And don't mess up other people's work.
Well, I've been lucky too, since I don't have like a commercial facility that's advertised, or whatever. It's all word of mouth. So, I know people that have had commercial studios, and, the people that call up out of the phone book when they had phone books, you would end up with some pretty wacky clients.
Yeah.
And I have been shielded from a lot of that just because it's all word of mouth recommendations. Still a huge variety of different types of people, but you know what I mean? I've been able to kind of not pick and choose, but it kind of limits to stuff usually a little better than the usual crowd.
Yellow page group. Yeah. I'm curious about what your strangest session you've ever done. I mean, for me, the two ones that I remember the most is a guy who was a one-man band that had a specially tricked out upright piano. It was the most difficult thing to properly mic that I'd ever experienced. That was really wacky. And the other thing was, I mean, this is the one I might have been wise to excuse myself on. It was a mandolin orchestra, which, yes, I mean that.
How many?
It was 12 mandolin players. It was pretty close to torture. So I'm wondering what has been some some of the wackiest recordings.
Well, this isn't really technical, but some guy, I don't know how he got a hold of me, but he wanted to record some opera vocals. He was almost kind of like, you remember Andy Kaufman had this character of this foreign guy?
Yeah.
That just some random foreign guy that you couldn't tell where he was from, but he was foreign.
Right.
And this guy kind of talked like that.
Oh,
and he shows up at my studio. He's smelled really bad. And, I mean, didn't look dirty, but he just smelled really bad. And then he wanted to record this stuff. So I had to tell him that we needed to leave the door open.
Oh.
And I had to come up with some reason why, technically. And then what he would do is he had these kind of music -1 opera things, and he would sing over them. I didn't know any of this till he got here. The thing was, he knew this stuff inside and out, but he was a terrible singer. So, I mean, he knew where to come in and all this stuff for the most part. He knew it all, by heart.
Right.
But it was really terrible. So I just tried to get the session done as quick as I could. Because I also didn't want to milk it out for his money either.
Yeah, right. Well, I would imagine being in LA, something like that happens, and you got to wonder if you aren't on Punk'd the show or something that, right?
Yeah. But I've had a few kind of more wacky things like you're talking about technically. This month I have the LA Flute Orchestra coming back. I've done them 2 or 3 times, and it's 9 or 10 different flutes and a conductor. So they don't do. I have video connections between my booths that are in the house and in here, and stuff. So they have a conductor, no click. So they watch the conductor. And one of the main things is they had always recorded kind of live concert things because it's a classical type of group.
Right.
And piccolos would just kill everything.
Oh, sure.
And they have contrabass, contra F flutes and sub-contras and stuff that sound just amazing, but they don't put out any volume.
Yeah, they get buried.
It's just kind of like a wind going, whoa, And so they wanted to get separation and be able to do separate yet live, which is kind of one of the things that I've pursued in my setup. So, but it involves a lot of setup because I have to get headphones for everybody, and I have the sub-contras together in one place, and then I try to get the piccolo separate from the other flutes. So if I can't get every single person isolated, but try to isolate what they want, like the soloist and things like that. So that's fairly challenging. That brings me to one of my rants, if you want to hear, is headphone mixes. Because one of the things I've done in my studio is I try to have separate headphone mixes for everybody. Because I've worked, after working one session for an Alex Klein record at, I think it was O. Henry in Burbank, or one of the high-dollar studios, they had a bunch of ISO booths and a big area because they did a lot of orchestras there too, but only 2 headphone mixes.
Yeah.
And it was ridiculous. I mean, you spend all this time trying to get a compromised headphone mix, and then nobody's happy and nobody can really hear. Yeah. And plus I was playing organ. I had a Leslie in a closet off to the side. It was an Alex Klein tune that went for 20 minutes or something. That went from a whisper to a roar. So by the time it was at the end, like if I had the organ loud enough to hear when I had the solo, it would have been blasting everybody in the quiet part, and I had to share a headphone mix. So I ended up jerry-rigging my own headphone mix by putting mics on the Leslie, running it to a little mixer with earbuds that I put inside of the headphones that I had from the studio, so I could actually just crank the organ at that moment when I had the solo. Other than that, I would have just been playing off of looking at my fingers.
Right.
Because literally, I mean, it's one thing if you're playing piano, you can crack a headphone, you can still kind of hear it. It's acoustic.
Yeah. Right.
You know, even if it's not enough, you can kind of hear it. But if you're playing an electronic instrument that the speaker's completely isolated from you, you know, it's all about the headphones. So at that point, I kind of vowed that I would rig up my studio so that there's always separate mixes for everybody, and try to have reverb in them to create a virtual space and stuff. And I've had a number of people who were skeptical about separation that ended up going like, I forgot that I was in a separate room.
Cool.
You know, because I have video going back and forth as well and stuff. So I think that's important, because one of the things is if you do have isolation, you have so much more control later in the mix, even if you're not editing, just for, you know, lack of leakage and stuff.
Flexibility. You know, I appreciate you saying that. I had a studio, and, you know, we had a very limited budget, and so we decided, well, we're going to put it in the mixer and the mix down in some effects and stuff, and we totally cheaped out on the headphones. And I know for a fact there were a number of clients that liked everything about the studio, except they hated the headphone mix and wouldn't come back.
Well, that's the place where the rubber hits the road with the client is
right.
You know, what they're hearing while they're playing.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like for you, a lot of that is related to getting better performances. One of the things you do is you do a lot of performance recording. You know, even if it's gonna be mixed down or overdubbed, a lot of times though you have a number of people in the building. The headphone mix is one combination. What other things do you do to sort of like draw a better performance out of people?
Well, I'm not super like Mr. Empathetic psychologist.
Okay.
I usually try to just stay out of the way, try not to use judgmental language as much as possible. But at the same time, you know, it's important to be honest. Like, I just can't lie about music. So, like, if somebody's just something I don't think is very good, and they'll go, how was that? I'll just turn it around, like, what'd you think?
Yeah.
You know, and then just try to see which one they like better.
Try to gauge it from them, right?
But mostly it's just trying to make sure the headphones are right and everybody can see what they need to see. It's interesting that people think they need to see more than they really do.
Right.
Because, I mean, if they're on stage, a lot of them have their eyes closed.
Right. They're not staring at it, the rest of the people, right?
But they get in the studio, they go like, oh, this guy, I can't see him. You know, it's like, well, if you're the saxophone player and you were standing in the front of the stage and everybody was behind you, could you see them either?
Right,
you know,
right.
I mean, I don't know. It's kind of a case-to-case basis. Yeah. I think the most thing is just try to make it run smooth and not, because technical problems always bum people
derail,
out, you know?
Derail the thing, yeah.
They always happen, so it's just a matter of trying to solve them as quick as you can.
If I think about it, one of the things I know is that there are a number of different ways that people do individualized headphones. There are some people that like the engineer to control it, and you'll see either like them using a board with a ton of sends, or they'll get like one of these live boards that have a big matrix mixer or something like that. Other people just pipe out a bunch of stuff and use like these little Axiom mixers at every station. And other people just use a DAW with a ton of sends specific for headphones. What's the approach that you take for that?
I'm kind of a believer in the engineer controlling it, because as I've talked to other engineers that they use the ones where there's personal mixers for every person, if you go out at the end of the session, everything's turned up. Because musicians who are not engineers don't know that stuff can be turned down. They always think of up.
Yeah.
So, like, oh, I can't hear enough bass, so that comes up. Like, oh, now I can't hear the piano, so that goes up. So by the end of the session, they just keep cranking everything instead of realizing, oh, the bass was too loud. If I turn that down, I can hear everything else. So I have a little Oz mixer that has 6 outputs and 4 different sends And also, it has an effect thing that's stereo that I use for another stereo.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And then I control that. And then if I need more, I do the DAW thing. I use mostly Digital Performer, which has Q-Mix.
Right.
And I'll send that out to like a little, like Behringer headphone mixer, because I want to have a separate one. I don't need a headphone mixer with 7 outputs of the same mix. So if you buy the little Behringer $20 headphone mixer, they have I think 4 outputs, but I'll just use one of them, and plug it into one of the outputs from DAW.
Just
and that's also
get enough gain.
Somebody really needs a specialized mix, they'll get that, because I can pan stuff around and have a whole mixer just for one person that way.
Sure, that's cool. Now, one of the things I noticed in reading the Tape Up article is that you aren't scared to talk about having gone digital relatively early and stuck with it. Is there anything about the analog domain that you find? I mean, it's sort of coming back, but do you have any desire ever to look back in that direction, or do you find yourself still completely satisfied with digital work?
Totally satisfied. I hate tape. I have to use it, because I do transfer stuff, because one of the things that I do is transfer old tapes and remaster them and stuff.
Okay.
Which I've done the last few, not few actually, it's building up now, but Art Pepper stuff is a record company. His wife puts out stuff, and a lot of that stuff is reel to reel. So, I mean, and the more I have to deal with those transfers, the more I realize how much I hate tape, because you got to clean the heads, you got to bake the tapes, if they're from a certain area. You do one transfer and then something screws up, you do it again. It's like the speed is slightly different if you're trying to edit together. For me, it was like the first time I heard a CD was a classical thing in some guy's house. He had Voice of the Theater speakers, some big old stereo thing. He played this classical thing, and it just blew me away because, A, no surface noise.
Right.
And for me, that would seal the deal right there, because it was this classical music that was starting at a pianissimo, and you could hear every little thing.
Right.
And that, which would have been lost in the LP surface noise until it got to a certain level.
Right.
And for me, that was like, wow, we've got a recording thing that's just the music now, and not all this other crap. And the thing is, it's all artificial. It's all recording. The only thing that's natural is you in a room listening to an acoustic instrument with no amplification.
Right.
And people get into this stuff like, oh, it's more natural. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, it's not. It's another technology.
Yeah, it's a different set of artifacts that maybe you aren't used to, so they seem interesting.
It's colored in a way that people like.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I figured out early on that digital, would just bump stuff between 2 and 3K, which was why people thought it, and it really wasn't bumped, it just wasn't cut down.
Cut out, right, yeah.
So it actually was more natural to be more harsh.
Yeah.
So, but people didn't like it, because they preferred that other sound. So all you got to do is cut that frequency a bit, and that's stuff that I did early on when I was comparing what was going on. The other thing that I do that not a lot of people do is I do a lot of really very tight surgical EQ cuts, I find resonances and cut them rather than doing if it's well recorded. If it's not well recorded, you got to do more radical EQ things. But if it's well recorded, if you go through and you find the resonances that are kind of eating up stuff, whether it's in the lows, mids, or highs, and especially in the highs, if you do surgical cuts between 2 and 3K on those nodes that are what some people call whistle tones when you boost it, and then cut those, and pretty conservatively cut them, just a couple of dB or something, you're not radically cutting it. Then you still have that, the presence that you want in that high range, and you cut out harshness magically almost.
Right.
Yeah,
it's amazing how some very gentle EQ work in the digital to get you a long way. I'll tell you, I'm with you. I'll use tape sometimes now just as like an artifact creator. I just
Hmm.
have a little Tascam 40 studio that if something sounds too good, I'll put it through that because it shits it up, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But man, I remember the days running
But there's so
recording
many
studio.
plugins for that now
Yeah,
that
right
really
there. That's true
they
too.
get even if they only get 95% there, it's convenient.
Right.
I mean,
But I
that's
remember,
the way I
like
look at it.
back in the days with the multi-track reel-to-reel, how often there would be just like some real session killers. First of all, if it's a long tune, just the rewind time, a lot of times would really get people out of the
Or
flow
running
of
out of tape. How
or
about
running
that
out of
one?
tape. Oh, that's a killer. And then also, we were using a Tascam MS-16, so you kind of had to use the noise reduction DBX
Yeah,
noise reduction. And DBX, while it was effective in some areas, it could really cook some other sounds. And it was like, especially, a warm bass tone would just get kind of crackly, and it would do this weird compression things to cymbals again that were
yeah.
just obnoxious. And I remember really sometimes it felt like you were really fighting the system just to get a good sound.
Well, I have a nostalgic thing because I grew up like recording on tape.
Yeah.
And a couple of years ago, I did a session that was on 2-inch 24 that I played on at a studio in Santa Monica, and it was kind of cool. The coolest thing is that there's a performance mentality because it's not as easy to edit and punch in and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
or add 24 tracks of soloist or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's something about that, but you know, just realizing, I mean, and the engineer like screwed up a couple of punches. You're waiting around for rewind, uh, and then the performance thing has its downside too because in the group, like the drummer and I were the best players. Not being egotistical because we're all on the food chain at some place. I've been the worst player in the room on a number of occasions. But this one, me and the drummer were pretty good, and the other people kept blowing the takes, and it was just like, oh, crap, man. We had to keep doing, like
The whole
redoing
thing.
punches where the guy would keep screwing up the punch, so we had to go back a bar before, and, you know, all this stuff, So there's aspects that younger people that think that they like that, they don't understand some of the practical aspects. I kind of look at it like Civil War reenactors. It's like there's something cool about it historically and everything,
But you don't want to
but
live that life.
no, you don't want to ride a horse to work every day. It might be cool one day, to get the feeling for what it was like, you know.
Yeah,
But I mean, the technology is just head and shoulders so much better now
right.
on recording. And plus, it's just a cost. Anytime people will because I have a 2-inch 24 here, and sometimes people will go, "Oh, we want to use that." It's like, okay, you ready for like $345 a reel?
Yeah,
And they
three
go,
reels
what?
minimum for an album, right?
And it's like, and they go, what? Because I had to deal with, it's just a scale of things. Like, cause I went from DAT to ADAT, because I've always been kind of on the budget end of things. And, at a certain point, when hard drive recording was coming in, even people were balking at the cost of ADAT tape,
Right, right.
which was way cheaper than analog tape. And, but once you get used to like having a hard drive that you can put every project of your whole life on one project, like when people start saying, no, this is how much the tape's going to cost, they kind of go, what?
Well, unfortunately, this has been a great conversation. Unfortunately, we're already out of time, and I feel like the conversation just got started. But before I let you go, you're a person I'm anxious to ask this question on, which is in your career, uh, particularly on the recording side, who is the most influential person that that has kind of helped you move forward or inspired you to move forward? And also on the gear side, what's the gear piece that you kind of identify most as part of your sound, or in a way, a piece of gear that might have been influential too? So kind of like the side of both people and of the technology.
Yeah. Well, those are hard questions for me because I don't usually think in terms of hierarchy of that kind of stuff. But in terms of people, I was lucky, since I'm kind of self-taught, I was lucky enough to be able to be around people that really knew what they were doing and kind of pick their brains and watch them work and stuff. So in terms of real engineers, not as famous as much as just really good, would be John Golden, who's a mastering engineer, who did a ton of stuff in the 70s, still doing stuff. And I got to see him master a number of records that I was on or I had recorded and watch him work and watch him talk about what he was doing, because he would kind of describe what he was doing while he was doing it.
Uh-huh.
And then other people, I was assistant to this jazz saxophonist, Benny Wallace, when he was doing a lot of film scores in L.A. in the 90s, and got to be on sessions at Capitol and Ocean Way and Village and different places like that, and watch engineers like, he would use this guy Roger Rhodes from New York who'd worked with Ellington and stuff, and got to watch how he would mic things. Bruce Botnick, who worked with the Doors, and also Leslie Jones, the woman, one of the first like kind of really well-known women engineers in fairly recent times, who worked at Capitol, and people like that. So I had the opportunity to kind of absorb that, even though I wasn't really trained. And then also in that period, I was working at the Musicians Union had a recording studio, and I started working there with some friends of mine that were also musician engineers, and we were kind of learning together. So that was kind of, we would compare notes and do stuff and whatnot. And so that the self-learning was kind of self-learning by these three guys, Vince Tividad, who's a bass player, and Jim Watson, who was a drummer, and they were also good engineers, or became even better. They were much better than I was, and Vince actually had training. So, kind of absorbed from them.
Well, you must have seen some amazing people come through a studio at the LA Musicians Union, too.
Yes and no. Because it was for the musicians, it was like subsidized and it was fairly cheap. There were some people. Also, but on these movie sessions, I got to work with,
the
people
top
like
of the top. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. John and
Wow.
Booker T, and actually got to test like piano, like while Booker T was playing organ. So I actually got to play with him.
Unreal.
Stuff like that. And then to your other question, gear-wise, to me, it's always been about trying to make the best sound, to get away with the best sound without having the complete budget.
Right.
So when I started, I just had some dynamics and a couple of Radio Shack condensers and stuff, and Radio Shack PZMs. And then my first really good mics were 421s. I got 3 or 4 of them used.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I was using them for overheads because they were the best things I had, which is interesting because if you just add some treble boost to them, they sound great as overheads. In fact, I listened to some of those older jazz recordings that I was doing that on, and the overhead sound, the drum sounds fine.
Oh, that's wild. I would have never imagined that. That's cool.
Yeah, well, you just do what you got to do, and I've been able to accumulate much better mics, as I go along. But it's also, like I said before, it's about where you put them, because it's just, if you don't point them in the right place and put them in the right place, they're not going to sound that good. Yeah. One of my favorite little stories was that one of my early releases actually was going to get reviewed in Absolute Sound, the audiophile thing, and the guy called me. And then he actually hung up on me when I told him I use a Yamaha SPX 90 for reverb.
Oh, no.
But that showed me the total bullshit of all of that stuff, because basically he liked it until he found out that what the reverb was, and it just was cognitive dissonance for him.
Oh, no. That's hilarious. Well, Wayne, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was fun, and like I said, it just feels like the conversation just got started. Next time I'm out in LA, I'm gonna look you up. Come and hang out. We'll go for coffee or something. It'll be cool to hang out face to face as
Yeah,
well.
please do.
But thank you so much, and with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Many thanks to Wayne for spending the time to have that chat. It was really fun to get caught up with what he's doing. Heard a little bit about his perspective of the recording world, which truly flies in the face of a lot of hipster thought, but the guy's been doing it for a long time and he's worked with a lot of great people. I want to thank you all for listening again this week. Thanks for everyone who's been so supportive. Thanks again to Cycling 74, to Syntopia, and to all the other folks in there that are chipping in to make this more accessible and a better place to hang out. We'll catch you next time around. Bye.